The 9.6.0 PTB patch notes were fairly anticipated for the week we had to wait for them, especially with the 8 killer buffs listed in the community stream. It didn't help for me that 2 of those happened to be my 2 favorite killers to play, those being Springtrap, my secondary, and the reason I'm actually in Dead by Daylight's community as a whole, and my current main and probably permanent main, Ghostface. I was ecstatic to hear that Ghostface could be receiving something to help push him up a bit, because even though I've only been playing the game for about a year at this point, I'm well aware of where Ghostface falls in a general strength tier list, and I've spent enough time playing to generally grasp his strengths and weaknesses. Then on April 7th, the patch notes were put out, and while Springtrap got a few nice adjustments and an entire control rebinding his quality of life, which I'm not complaining, it was very much needed, there was one thing I found myself disappointed with. Ghostface got one single change, and it was just 2 seconds being taken off Nightshroud's cooldown. Around 5 months ago now, I made a video discussing my thoughts on ways behavior could reasonably buff Ghostface without reworking him entirely or changing his identity as a killer. To give a summary, my basic ideas were: make Wally's matchbook and headline cutouts fully base kit, reducing Nightshroud's cooldown to 14 seconds and making him 40% faster while stalking, make Chewed Pen and Lasting Perfume base kit so downed and hooked survivors take longer to reveal him, 3 seconds now instead of 1.5, make Drop Leg Knife Sheath base kit to give him some utility at the start of a chase with a marked survivor, rework those listed add-ons now that they've been implemented into his power, as well as a general rework to quite a few more, those being Cinch Straps, Marked Map, Olsen's Journal, Telephoto Lens, Leather Knife Sheath, and Night Vision Monocular. Potentially also do something with Ghostface caught on tape, either being made base kit, partially or otherwise, or reworking it to give a stronger effect in general, and a 5 to 10% haste while in Nightshroud and while not seen by any survivor. Now, whether or not these changes would actually meaningfully buff Ghostface in any way is very debatable, especially when factoring in that palette density is still quite an issue, and now solo queue is getting a general buff with being able to view their teammates' builds, but implementing at least a few of these would do more for him than just reducing Nightshroud's cooldown to 15 seconds. It baffles me that behavior is seemingly terrified of meaningfully strengthening killer that is, for all intents and purposes, potentially weaker than Trapper, the killer that has been universally deemed bottom tier since Skull Merchant's ascension from hell anyway. What reason could behavior have for not giving Ghostface, seemingly one of their most flexible licenses to deal with, any meaningful buffs in the game? I'm still relatively new, only playing for a year, remember, so I can only take a few guesses, but my first one is that he's just a relatively simple killer to grasp, and they're too scared of making him stronger and potentially more complex and turning people away from him. We saw this mentality with how Springtrap was designed, how they chose not to adapt his stealth all too much, a key aspect of his gameplay and behavior in FNAF 3, in favor of generalizing the franchise and being simple and still fun to play. That being said, Springtrap is still far more complex than Ghostface, with changing movement speeds in his doors, his access AoE, and his own reveal mechanic. Ghostface only has Nightshroud, and nothing in Chase or otherwise, never mind the fact that Ghostface was added over 6 years ago now, soon to be 7 in a few months, and is already a fairly popular pick among killer players in general because it's Ghostface, one of the most iconic horror slashers. My other main theory as to why is that Ghostface is probably far stronger in solo queue lobbies than he is against a Swift, or a team on VC and Discord. Ghostface is a stealth killer that truly, really thrives when the survivor team cannot communicate with each other and or has no clue how to properly counter Ghostface. Unlike Myers, who has a global sound cue for his power, and Wraith, who has to sound a bell to cloak and decloak, Ghostface makes no sound when entering or breaking out of Nightshroud, and oftentimes has a better chance sneaking up on players who aren't prepared. That's not to downplay Wraith and Myers, by the way. Both are fairly decent killers in their own right, and those sounds frankly don't hinder them in the slightest. right spell could even be mind game potential, and we all know how Myers is dealing now that he has become Dash Slop. The general point is that Ghostface thrives against survivors that are either inexperienced, poor at teamwork and communicating, or both. However, against experienced teams or a friend group on VC, Ghostface becomes miserable to play as. The thing with Ghostface is that without his ability to sneak around and mark the survivors, he either has to play for good chases, or hope he can mark them and chase fast enough at the right time to down the survivor. This wouldn't be an issue if Ghostface wasn't absolutely horrible in chase and without his fundamental power. When teams can properly keep tabs on Ghostface, communicate to each other, and keep him broken out of Night Shroud, there is nothing Ghostface can really do. He can stomp public lobbies a good chunk of the time, but the rest of his matches are awful for him and usually don't end well. This gap between solo queue and Swift is probably a big contributor as to why behavior seemingly won't buff Ghostface meaningfully. They're probably scared he'll be too strong in solo queue and make the survivor community despise him, which is a fair assumption. However, I'd argue that behavior needs to put their foot down and really give this killer his moment to shine, especially since he's suffering greatly as a killer in the current meta and the state of the game in general. So, what do I think behavior should do 5 months after my last video, while also keeping it realistic to what they might actually do? Truthfully, I think a fair amount of my changes from the last video I did still apply. The 5 add-ons I suggested being made base kit should still happen, although drop leg is pushing it quite a bit. I'd also advocate for Night Shroud's cooldown to be further reduced to about 12 to 13 seconds. I also still think the haste and stealth wouldn't be too problematic. It really should only realistically apply when he is not in chase with a survivor or not being spotted by a survivor. That way it's still fair that he has the haste and stealth and gives him a small mobility boost without it being detrimental to the survivors. However, in the event that I misjudged how much behavior cares about Ghostface and none of those get implemented at all, an add-on pass is also kind of likely. But I'm not entirely excited about the idea of his add-ons being reduced to ways to buff him without behavior buffing his base kit. Maybe it's just the fact that I'm desperate for my boy to receive some love in the balancing field. To be completely honest though, there's a part of me that really fears that any changes to Ghostface to make him stronger will be met with severe, harsh backlash from a subsection of the survivor community that already hates him, probably because they hate stealth killers. It seems fairly obvious, at least to me right now, that behavior in the last year or so has noticeably favored survivors, and have only really reacted to backlash in relation to anything impacting their gameplay if it was too much for them to handle, such as fog vials, conviction, the streetwise bug, pallet density, and the PTBs that test anti-slug and anti-channel changes. Those last ones in particular bother me, as the second attempt at those PTBs showed a clear misunderstanding in the community through them attributing people saying the survivor buffs were too handholdy to the killer buffs and only nerfing them. Behavior standards are also wildly inconsistent, with them clearly valuing survivor gameplay more, while also ignoring things such as the Doctor's VFX bug that induces migraines or seizures into actual people. Shia in particular has been advocating for this since it was introduced in the 8.6.0 patch, and Behavior still failed to fix it despite acknowledging it as a bug and currently trying to improve accessibility with the new aura recolors. In fact, after I wrote this script, believe it or not, they acknowledged on Reddit they have no plans to change the VFX despite knowing what this is causing and how many tickets it has been open on Beta Hub. It's... why? This weird gap in behavior standards makes no sense and also terrifies me. It really feels like the second they get any complaints or backlash from survivor players, should they try meaningfully updating Ghostface, they'll just revert them or make the changes minimal and essentially useless. More often than not, at least in my experience and based on how I've seen the community act online within the last year, survivors tend to be much worse with their general behavior and how they act when complaining about changes to the game. Killer players aren't angels, they do this too, but more often than not, it's the survivor player base, and the fact that my favorite killer could potentially get meaningfully buffed in a PTB eventually, only for those buffs to be weakened when coming to live because a section of the community that already dislikes him or if I'm really unlucky, the entire Survivor player base raises enough backlash for behavior to notice, it's kind of frustrating. This isn't me trying to shove an us versus them moment into the video, by the way. I've started playing a fair amount of Survivor 2, so I can generally get better at the game and understand both sides. About a third of my total playtime is on Survivor now, and I'm not particularly great, but I do feel like I'm at least at a point where I sort of have general fundamentals down, even if I torture myself by only playing solo queue. Don't do that. Getting back on topic, my main point is that what seems to be an inherent bias internally at behavior towards the Survivor player base could realistically result in any meaningful, impactful changes made to Ghostface being reverted or minimized if the Survivor player base's outcry is loud enough. All of this to say that my confidence in behavior properly giving Ghostface some love and attention he deserves is non-existent, especially since the killer that received the most buffs in the PTB was Wesker, of all killers. So yeah, see you all next year when they make Night Shroud's cooldown 13 seconds, rework Wally's matchbook, and then make the marks last 62 seconds.